Hi, everyone. Today we are beginning our first lecture, which is in a series to celebrate Marx's birthday. We're going to take this month time to think through our current context and the various sort of limitations and difficulties that we are facing in the world, not just today, but have been facing in the recent past. And we thought we would take this opportunity to use Marx as a window into understanding the current context that we face. This is the beginning of a series of talks that we will host as SRWP for the next month. We will be beginning with the history of Karl Marx's life, but as well as looking at the origins, the early origins of the development of capitalism. It's really important that we get the story right, because it's not just a story of the past or a nice story to know. It also helps us understand the current context that we are in. And while today we'll be focusing a lot on Europe itself and England in particular, we understand that as the series grows, it'll be looking more and more at the ways in which capitalism has developed and worked globally. And what you find happening is that this is an opening up. It's a story of us all and how we come to exist in this modern world. It's a story of exploitation and oppression, and it also allows us to understand how capital works and what it has done in the world to render some people exploitable and other people elite. So we will begin the series today, and hopefully from next week we are able to increase this, looking at other topics such as imperialism, looking at actual texts of Marx. We will also be looking at key concepts from Marx throughout this month, as well as then finally ending up looking at the development of capitalism right here in South Africa. Along the way, we will also look at the impact of imperialism and the anti-imperialist struggles of Africa. So we would like to begin this series now, and I'm going to switch over onto a share screen mode, which has the PowerPoint that we have produced. I would also like to point out that while we are using this as a multimedia platform, we will also be able to have these slides available in different formats, one of them being PDFs, so that we will be able to share this very easily and all the information on WhatsApp platforms and various other platforms that do not require as much data. So we are hoping to have this in different levels available to people, not just in South Africa, but around the world. So I think we will begin with that. Okay, I'm going to share screen now. Okay, great. So I think the first and most important thing for us to consider on this very important day of Marx's birthday is the birth of Marx, his life, and what he lived through, and some of his own experiences. This is not just important to give us insight into the life of Karl Marx himself, but also the networks that he was engaging with, his intellectual life, as well as his political life, which was very important in shaping his politics and his ideology. Also, it tells us how Marx becomes one of the key central figures of communism in the world. What we have to understand is communism is a type of ideology within the broader school of socialism, and Marxism is one of those. But Marx becomes the fundamental feature and the key sort of focus of communism from 1848 onwards, right up until today, right? So one of the key stories we need to begin to tell and think through is the relevance of Marx today. With the sort of global crisis that we are having around COVID-19 pandemic, many people are beginning to realize that capitalism really is a destructive system. It's a system that's not only destroying our daily lives in terms of economically marginalizing and oppressing us, but it's actually destroying the planet. It has huge consequences for nature. It has huge consequences in how we reproduce ourselves, our quality of life. It has created a highly unequal society. And we have, for example, 1% of the world's population in control of most of the wealth of society, and majority of society living in very oppressive and exploitative conditions. this is something that has allowed people, especially now with the onset of COVID-19, that has made the contradictions of capital so apparent to everyone. Think through what is wrong with capitalism, what it is we need to change. And as a result, many people are beginning to turn to different ways of thinking through the economy, thinking through the society we live in. And one of the key ideologies that are coming to the fore once again is Marxism. While Marxism has remained relevant throughout the 20th century, what you have after the fall of the Berlin Wall is the rise of neoliberal politics and the sort of onslaught of neoliberal ideology, which is based very much in consumerism. And you've had the fading away or the sort of negation of class politics as well as Marxism. It was seen as something that was backward, of the past. However, having witnessed the devastation of capital, people are really beginning to question the role of capitalism in society and looking around for different alternatives. I do think that while that is happening on one hand, there's also a rise, we've seen this in South Africa as well, of a very anti-communist line that has developed, especially by the right wing. They realize that they have no more solutions, but they wish to frame any of the attempts of state, of people, of different organizations to deal with the crisis of capitalism in communist terms as a negative. So that is something we need to begin to really work on and look through, because we need to understand that Marxism is incredibly relevant. We need to do the work now of beginning to think through Marxism and really beginning to popularize it, but also to make sure that we understand the concepts of Marxism. We understand what are the goals and the ambitions of Marxism. So hopefully in some small way, we can begin to do this. For now, I would like to begin, I think, with a sort of very important quote from Samora Machel, who was the leader of independent Mozambique. And while it was written, he was speaking about 30 years ago, it still remains very relevant for us on the continent, but also globally. And this is what he had to say about Marxism. He says, Marxism is the science of revolution. It is the fruit of practice of mankind's struggle for a better future, and so is renewed and developed through human practice. The experience of revolutionary struggle of the Mozambican people provides an illustration of this principle. A century after the death of Marx, the cause of socialism and communism has ceased to be a dream and has become a reality that has changed the world. The vitality of revolutionary science, systematized by Marx, can have no better proof than the facts for themselves. Now, Samora Machel was writing this, speaking this at a time when Marxism on this continent was actually very popular. We don't have that privilege anymore. It is not popular on our continent anymore. It has declined. The ideologies of it has declined. Capitalism has been very successful in vilifying Marxism. However, if you look at the gains, even the small gains of post-colonial Africa, what you realize that the best aspects of it come from attempts to build socialism, come from attempts to use Marxism to improve society. And this is that moment that Samora Machel is talking about. And very importantly, it also gets us to understand that communism and Marxism itself has a very long history on our continent. Often we are led to believe that any discussion around Marx or any discussion about communism is an imposition. This is especially done by nationalist leaders. It's an imposition on us of Western thought. But what you begin to understand is that it is about mankind's struggle. It's about all men, all women. It's about our entire struggle for the emancipation and liberation, for a better life for all of us. And that is what is at the heart of communism and Marxism. What you also find for the last 100 years is that whenever there are very serious and concrete attempts to liberate society and aspects of society where there's deep oppression, whether it's racial, gender, class, it's Marxism that, and Marxist thinkers and activists who have been at the forefront of those liberatory movements. So it's not something that's owned by one particular people. It's like Christianity or any other ideology or religious movement owned by all of humanity. It's been produced by us together. So while my story is going to start in the very particular, I think it is a very universal story. And that's where we will hopefully go through the next month with this series of lectures and talks. If we begin with Marx's life, we need to ask this question: who is Marx? Who is Karl Marx? This might seem a very basic question, especially for many people who like to think of themselves on the left, who like to think of them as Marxist. But very importantly, we have to understand, given the decline of and the declining popularity of Marxism globally, we need to begin to do this very basic work, this very sort of what we would call the resurrecting again of Marx and who he was, and making him living again for the world. That is incredibly important, and it's work that we should continuously be doing. These series of lectures aren't for people who already think they know their Marx and know what version of Marxism they ascribe to, and the various debates of Marxism. This is for people who are coming into it, who are asking questions about the current system we labor under, and who is looking for answers in different ways. So it is an introductory lecture. It's not something that is at the next stage or level dealing with Marxist theory. It's a very introductory lecture. So Karl Marx was born in a part of Germany known as Trier. He was born on the 5th of May, 1818. And he is considered to be one of the greatest philosophers and the founder of the theory that comes to be known as Marxism. He did not do this alone. He did this in conversation with a variety of people, in particular Friedrich Engels, who we will be introduced to shortly. His father's name was Heinrich Marx, and his mother was Henrietta Marx. They had 9 children, and he grew up in a very sort of middle-class family life. His family were Jewish, but they were not practicing Jews, and Marx seemed to have had a very comfortable life. However, from his 9 siblings, a few of them died very young, including his oldest brother, Moritz. Marx was, for most of his childhood, educated at home by his father. However, he began high school in 1830, and he went to a high school which was started by and run by Hugo Wittenbach, who was a very important educationalist during this period. Marx spent 5 years in high school, and in 1835, he entered into the University of Bonn at the age of 17. Marx desperately wanted to study philosophy and engage with the world of ideas and understand the human condition. However, his father had requested him to study law. And I think Marx was not alone in his desires to understand the human condition, to think through the world. He was living at a time when capitalism was on the rise, when exploitation of people was very apparent and all around him, and people were trying to think through what was happening. A lot of the religious sort of reforms had already been put in place, but the bulk of power still remained with a minority of people. So there was a lot of questioning around this, especially in parts of Western Europe. Germany becomes a central focus of this, especially with new sorts of ideas from key thinkers such as Hegel and so on. Marx joined the university. He was obviously very naturally talented as a human being, but he also had the capacity for great fun, like I think many communists do, despite what capitalists tell you about communism. And he joined what's called the Trier Tavern Club, which was a drinking society. So being occupied with the drinking society, of which he becomes the president of, as well as his philosophical sort of musings and endeavors, his studies and his results actually take a huge knock. And by the end of 1835, his marks have declined greatly. He then goes on summer break, and it's over this period that his father then says that he has to move to the University of Berlin, which his father thinks is a far more serious space for his son. And during the break of these 2 universities, Karl Marx then meets his wife, Jenny Westphalen, and they get engaged in 1836. They're engaged for a period of 7 years, and they eventually get married in 1843. While studying law and while at university, he becomes incredibly interested in the German philosopher George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. And Hegel brings a lot of things into philosophy, some of the ideas around metaphysics, around thinking through the spiritual world, but also around notions of time and shifts in time and the move forward into modernity. He's very concerned with how we move forward in society. However, the key concepts that Marx is interested in, that he takes from Hegel, is the dialectic method. And the dialectic method is a tool that we come to use to understand how the world is, how are things in the world, but then how does a position in the world, a material position in the world, change? How does it shift from one position to the next? And this is what Marx takes out of Hegel, is this notion of understanding how does things move from one position to the next position? What mechanisms that do that? What is the engagement between two things? And what's key in this is that there's an idea that there's a thesis, there is a position, then there's an opposition to that position, an antithesis, and those two engage each other. They lock together in what we, if for a want of a better word, we would say a discussion. They lock together, and then out of that comes the synthesis, the solution, right? Now, with Hegel, the idea was that each time you get a new synthesis, society is moving forward. It's becoming better. However, for Marx, the dialectic doesn't work in such a way. For Marx, the understanding is that that position that comes out of two opposites meeting could either be a move forward, that means something good, something liberatory, but it could also be a move backwards into the negative, something that could move society backwards and not forward. Now, we see this examples continuously in history. So, for example, if you looked at World War I, the people who went to fight in World War I believed that they were fighting the final war for the world, and that after this, no one would make such a ludicrous decision as to go into a war, and a global war at that. So it was a war to end all wars. However, we know very well, in less than 20 years later, we had experienced a second world war. So it's not necessary that society is moving forward, but there is motion and there is change in society. And that's what Marxists are also very interested in, that method of how things change. So that's a method that you also begin to get from Marx, lifted up and out of Hegel. By 1841, Marx finishes his PhD, and it is by 1843 that as his political career is growing through his student years, he then becomes the co-editor of what comes to be seen as a radical leftist newspaper. It's a newspaper that's out of Paris, and it's called the German-French Annals. It is during this period in 1843, October 1843, that Marx and his new wife move to Paris. In 1844, their daughter Jenny is born, and it is throughout this period that Marx is growing politically. He's engaged in political activism, and he's writing a lot about politics. And it's precisely during this time that Marx then meets, on the 28th of August, 1844, one of the most important relationships he is to develop in his life, which is with a German socialist called Friedrich Engels. And Friedrich Engels is really important in that he has already published works, very key works on communism, but he's also important in that he provides Marx with a lot of the sort of basis for some of the theory and ideas that Marx is experiencing. Friedrich Engels' family is a very wealthy family. They have many factories, especially in Manchester in England. And Engels himself, through his relationship with one factory workers who becomes his lifelong partner, Mary Burns, is really able to get into and understand the conditions of workers in the working class. And he brings this aspect very strongly into the theoretical work of Marx. And this is an important contributing factor to the development of Marxism and the notion and the centralization of the working class within this. Because communism and socialism has not always been based out of the working class. At various periods, it's different groups of people, often bourgeois people, who are interested in the liberation of society, not necessarily about the building of the power of the working class. And this, the coming together of these two minds of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, brings this really to the fore of communist thinking. We then have, through this friendship, you have the blossoming of a variety of things. Friedrich Engels has already written The Condition of the Working Class of England in 1844. And you have also the development of an intensive engagement with political economy by Marx. So economy becomes central to Marx's study, as well as a deep study of the French socialists and the history of France. So Marx always looks to understanding his contemporary society through a study of the history of a place. And I think this is a fundamentally important method that Marx gives us as well. He also, through this, is able to make very important and key sort of interventions into the field of history. Before Marx, history was usually written by, about the big man, about the kings, about a central figure, as if that central figure alone makes history. What Marx begins to do is he begins to situate history and the development of society with the producers of society. And this is very, very important intervention. It allows later on for the opening up of history to consider people who were enslaved, to consider people of different race groups, to consider women in history, and so on. It becomes a fundamental feature of the opening up of history. Marx doesn't just do that with history, he does it with sociology, anthropology, and various sort of fields within the social sciences. So Marx, I think he was at this period of his time very much influenced by three big things. One was Hegel's dialectic, the other was this French utopian socialism, which he was engagement with continuously. And in addition to this, he becomes very much sort of engrossed in understanding the making of the modern world that was at the time coming into being through the study of West Germany, Western Europe, and in particular England. And we see why England becomes the focus for Marx shortly. So Marx is able to pull all of these things, and with his time in Paris, he's able to develop and put into places the key pillars of what becomes Marxism by 1844. However, due to a variety of things, Marx is continuously pulled away from his studies and his sort of theoretical work. We must remember that while Marx had a PhD, was an intellectual, was busy developing new theories and understandings about the world, he was never ever based at a university. Marx was a lifelong activist and a political actor of the day. So he was constantly involved in the writing of and the publishing of radical newspapers, of organizing direct political efforts, as well as organizing various different political organizations across Europe. And while he was doing this, he was still always drawn back to thinking through the theory. So it was the marrying together of the struggle and the activism with the theory. And I think that is absolutely important if we want to think through Marx and his life. In addition to this, Marx and Engels, their work was not just, like I've mentioned, on the level of theory. They become central to the communist movement in Western Europe. And they begin to join what comes to be known as the League of the Just. And they are working out of England, and it's a group of artisans and workers who come together to form this organization. And it is this organization that commissions Marx and Engels to write the sort of program of their organization. It's the political program of their organization. And this comes to be known as the Communist Manifesto, and it was first released on the 28th of February, 1948. And it was also during this period of Marx's life, as he was growing as a political activist, that he begins to experience a lot of rejection, criticism from various different states across Europe. In fact, it was during this period that he was expelled from Belgium, and he then moved from Belgium to England permanently. Marx was born in Germany, but he died in England, and he continuously lived in exile for most of his adult life. For the next 10 years while Marx lived in England, it was a very difficult time for him. It wasn't just difficult in terms of his work and carrying out his activism. It was also difficult financially and personally. Marx could not get a job due to his politics, so he suffered great financial stresses. And in addition to this, the financial stresses led to huge difficulties in his personal life, including the death of several of his kids. It was during this time, due to the strain of the deaths of his kids, as well as the economic strain, that his wife, Jenny, also suffered from a mental breakdown. And this left a huge stress on the Marx family itself. Throughout this period, Engels was a constant companion to Marx. He wasn't just an intellectual companion, but he was also social and an intellectual companion as well, and provided Marx with financial help whenever he could. However, despite these various financial setbacks, by 1864, Marx was already a well-published Marxist scholar, a communist scholar, and the notion of Marxism had become quite entrenched in the global communist and socialist movement. However, there's an active retreat by both Marx and Engels during the 1850s from sort of overt political activism and action. However, they do become the key leading figures of what comes to be the International Workingmen's Association, which is the first international. And Marx continues to remain a very sort of seminal figure, an important figure, especially in England, for the communists and Marxists in England. However, in Europe, Marx is still quite marginal and is not well known. But with the onset of the Paris Commune in 1871, Marx becomes much more popularized across Europe. And the Paris Commune is a key turning point as well, in terms of Marx actually being able to witness what it would be like, what would be a society look like when workers harness the power of the state and begin to use their power to run society. The Paris Commune was an insurrection that was led by the working people of Paris against the French government. It began on the 18th of March, 1871, and it was workers took control of the whole of Paris. They set up commune governments, and amongst other things, they instituted the 10-hour workday. This was incredibly revolutionary in a time when workers had very few rights, certainly no amount of allotted time to work, and allotted time for private life. It was when the formation of capital within Europe was at its harshest. And Marx put his support fully behind the Commune. However, by the end of May 1871, the French government had managed to smash the Commune, killing thousands of workers, and effectively over the next few years, hounding and imprisoning many of the activists from the Commune. However, despite that setback, the Commune still remains a sort of guiding light for the internationalist communist movement around what it could be like to have a sort of society controlled by workers. And in fact, the key flag out of the Commune is the red flag that Lenin himself is draped in when he dies in the 1920s in Russia. It's not the flag of the Soviet Union. So that symbol is still very strong for communists around the world. It was also during this time that, it was during this time that Marx as well begins to become much more of a sort of leading figure in terms of people seeking his advice, in terms of communist leaders consulting him throughout the 1860s and 1870s. However, by the late 1870s and the early 1880s, Marx's life is marked by tragedy, the most devastating of which is the death of his wife, Jenny, on the 2nd of December, 1881. By now, Marx himself is a fairly old man. He has engaged very, very actively in politics throughout his life. He also is really able to use his political activism and work to understand society. He's at the cutting edge of the theory of the day. He publishes continuously, not just vast theoretical and historical texts such as Capital, 3 volumes of it. He also publishes continuously in newspapers. He's commissioned to publish around the world, especially in places like New York and so on. So he has a rich body of work and activism by the early 1880s. Marx himself dies on the 14th of March, 1883. And at the time of his death, Marx died stateless, and he died in exile like he lived most of his adult life. Marx was buried in Highgate Cemetery in London. You could still go and visit the cemetery if you ever have the opportunity of traveling there. and you could visit his tombstone is there. At his funeral, his closest friend and companion Engels had this to say: on the 14th of March, at 2:45 in the afternoon, the greatest living thinker ceased to think. He had been left alone for scarcely 2 minutes, and when we came back, we found him in his armchair, on to sleep, but forever. Marx's death was obviously, there was a huge interest in his death. At his actual funeral, very few people attended his funeral, and the reason for this was because there was miscommunication about his death, the time of his death, where he was, when he died, and so on. So it was after that there's a lot of outpouring and work done in order to honor Marx. I think for us, we need to understand that Marx's work had a profound impact, not only in terms of developing and advancing communism, but Marx made groundbreaking and vital contributions to the field of economics, history, philosophy, sociology, politics, geography, science, and many other fields. In fact, most of these fields, one would classify themselves as either Marxist in that field to denote that they have been inspired by, not just in terms of ideology, but even method of Marx. So Marx's history and understanding of the development of capitalism provides us not only with an understanding of how the modern world comes to be. So we come to understand this through the history that he writes of capitalism. But also, very importantly, Marx provides us with a method, a how-to understand this history. To understand the world, you can have a series of facts or a narrative that you are being told. The way you tell that narrative, the way you interpret that narrative, by whose lens and experiences you are using to tell that narrative, then shapes the outcome of that narrative. And Marx gives us that understanding, that your position in society and the power you hold in society will make you tell that story differently. So for example, if we had to look at the story of a war, of World War I, if we look at it from the sort of angle of, the generals and the war leaders, then they would say they were victorious, they had won this because of their great strategic thinking. But if you look at the impact that the war had on the working class, you will see that it was a bloody war, with the working class being sent to their deaths in their millions. And it tells you a very different story about whether this war was a success or not, or whether we should even have wars. So Marx brings this very importantly into how we understand our society, how we understand our human condition. And I think for us today, while we're trying to grapple with the devastating impact of capitalism, it is important for us to begin our journey, like Marx did, with the history and the development of capitalism. And while our story now begins in Western Europe, it is a story of how capitalism develops the particular mechanics of oppression and exploitation. And we need to understand this so that we understand how capitalism ascends, becomes successful, and then becomes central in dominating our lives even till today. What becomes very apparent when we are telling the story of capitalism and tracing it is that it begins in medieval Europe. But it is not a quick story. It's not a click of the finger and then you have capitalism. No, it's a story over 600 to 700 years, the development of capitalism. It's a story of nature, it's a story of technology, it's a story of knowledge, it's a story of religious change, it's a story of wars, it's a story of all of us and how we develop. It's a story of conquest and trade and exchange. It's a story of philosophy. So it is a holistic story, and it's a story that starts in Western Europe, but will eventually come to encompass the entire world. And we hope that through this, we are also able to demonstrate that history in the next month going forward.